People are going to betray you. That's not a guess, not a possibility, but a certainty. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can stop living like a victim. Now I know that sounds harsh, maybe even cold, but the truth often is, because betrayal isn't rare, it's common, and it doesn't always come from enemies. In fact, most of the time it comes from the people you trusted the most, the ones you believed would never cross that line. But let's slow down. Why do people betray others? Is it because they're evil? Is it just a lack of morality? Or is there something deeper, something ancient, coded into our very biology and psychology that makes betrayal not just possible, but predictable? From a psychological standpoint, betrayal is deeply tied to survival. At our core, every human being is wired to protect themselves first. This is not pessimism, it's evolutionary psychology. When we lived in tribes, any threat to our survival, whether social, emotional, or physical, had to be managed swiftly. That's why the brain evolved to prioritize self-interest. If betraying someone meant protecting your food source, your mate, your safety, you did it. And this didn't make you a monster. It made you a survivor. But here's where it gets interesting. Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant minds in the study of the human psyche, said that the human personality isn't just what we see on the surface. Beneath the face we show to the world lies the shadow, a hidden realm of impulses, instincts, desires, and fears we refuse to acknowledge. It's this shadow that often drives our decisions in the background, like a silent puppeteer. Jung believed that if we don't confront our shadow, it takes control. It begins to shape our actions, often leading to harm, not just to others, but to ourselves. And betrayal? It's one of the shadow's most common expressions. You see, people don't wake up one morning and decide to betray someone they care about. More often, it's a slow process, driven by hidden fears, unacknowledged needs, and unresolved wounds. What makes betrayal hurt so much is that it forces us to see reality more clearly than we ever wanted to. It pulls the mask off, not only from the person who betrayed us, but from ourselves. We're forced to question our own judgment, our perception, and maybe even our worth. And that's why it feels like an earthquake to the soul. But before we start blaming human nature, let's remember, betrayal isn't always born of malice. Often it's a response to pressure, scarcity, or fear. Neuroscientific research shows that when the brain perceives threat, real or imagined, it shuts down empathy and ramps up self-preservation instincts. That person who betrayed you, they might have convinced themselves it was the only option. So, if betrayal is hardwired into the human experience, what does that mean for us today? How can we protect ourselves without becoming bitter or paranoid? And how do we recognize when betrayal is creeping into our own decisions, disguised as something justified, something logical? This is where understanding the deeper psychology behind betrayal becomes not just useful, but essential. Because once we start to understand the why, we can stop feeling helpless and start making choices that are grounded in wisdom instead of woundedness. In the next part, we'll unpack why self-interest often triumphs over loyalty, and how Jung's shadow theory exposes the selfish truths we prefer to ignore. The deep-seated nature of human self-interest. Let's begin with a question most people avoid asking. Are we really as loyal and selfless as we think we are? Or are we just better at masking self-interest behind socially acceptable behavior? The answer isn't comforting, but it is liberating. Carl Jung believed that much of what drives us lies hidden in the unconscious, the part of the mind where instincts, emotions, and repressed urges live. And one of the strongest of those instincts is self-preservation. Now, betrayal might look like a conscious act, but most often, it bubbles up from the unconscious. Jung referred to the shadow, that buried part of ourselves that houses everything we deny or disown. It's the part of you that feels envy, that resents others' success, that wants to protect itself at all costs, even if it means hurting someone else. And the most dangerous thing about the shadow? It operates quietly. It justifies the act before we even know we've made a decision. Evolutionary psychology gives us another perspective. Our ancestors didn't survive by being kind. They survived by being clever, cautious, and yes, sometimes deceitful. Loyalty was a luxury. Survival was a necessity. Those instincts haven't disappeared. They've just been refined. Today, betrayal doesn't always mean stealing food or turning someone over to the enemy. It could look like gossiping about a friend, throwing a colleague under the bus to protect your job, or emotionally withdrawing from someone when they need you the most. This behavior is rooted in what psychologists call adaptive selfishness. According to research from the University of Zurich, self-preserving behavior often emerges in high-stress situations where resources, whether emotional or physical, are perceived as scarce. The human brain, particularly the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, responds by narrowing our moral vision. It prioritizes immediate gain over long-term connection. Jung's The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious explores how inherited patterns, what he called archetypes, shape our thoughts and reactions. One such archetype is the trickster. This figure exists in every culture and every mind. It represents cunning, deception, and betrayal, but also transformation. When someone betrays you, their trickster archetype might have been activated. But here's the uncomfortable truth: so has yours. Because betrayal always involves two unconscious minds colliding, each one protecting its own hidden fear or unmet need. The real tragedy is that we often expect loyalty from people who are still governed by their survival instincts. We hope for consistency from those who haven't even met their own shadow. This creates a psychological mismatch, one that almost guarantees disappointment. And when betrayal happens, we're left not just with a broken bond, but with a painful realization. We gave the best parts of ourselves to someone who was only giving what their unconscious allowed them to give. So how do we navigate this? First, by realizing that betrayal isn't always personal. It's often psychological. Second, by learning to see the signs, not just in others, but in ourselves. And third, by developing what Carl Jung called conscious integration of the shadow, bringing awareness to our own hidden motives so we can make choices from clarity instead of compulsion. And yet, even with all this knowledge, we still find ourselves shocked when loyalty breaks. Why? Because we believe betrayal is the exception, but maybe it's the norm, and loyalty, the rare and sacred act. Coming up next, we'll explore that very idea, how betrayal seems to be the default human behavior, and why true loyalty is so hard to find. Betrayal is the norm, loyalty as the exception. Most people live under the illusion that betrayal is rare, something that only happens when things go terribly wrong. But if you look closely at your life, or even human history, you'll notice something unsettling. Betrayal isn't the exception, it's the pattern. Think about friendships that faded without warning, promises broken without remorse, or partners who disappeared just when you needed them most. The idea that loyalty is the norm, it's comforting, but it's also misleading. Carl Jung warned us that unless we bring the unconscious into consciousness, it will rule our lives, and we'll call it fate. What does that mean in the context of betrayal? It means most people don't even realize when they're betraying someone, because their unconscious mind is running the show. They're not aware that fear is whispering in their ear, that unmet needs are pulling the strings. They believe they're making rational choices, when in truth, they're being driven by shadows they've never dared to face. This is where evolutionary psychology and behavioral economics align. Studies by researchers like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky show that humans make most decisions not by logic, but by emotional instinct disguised as rationality. When faced with a choice between protecting someone else and protecting themselves, most people choose the latter, and they do it with internal justification. I had no choice. I was just being realistic. They would have done the same to me. These are not just excuses. They're the defense mechanisms of a mind trying to protect its identity. Now imagine this. You're in a room with 10 people you trust. Statistically, most of them will put their own interests above yours when pushed to the edge. Not necessarily out of malice, but because the brain is wired for self-preservation. That doesn't mean everyone is a villain. It means we're all human, and humanity carries within it a complicated blend of loyalty and fear, connection and survival. Jung's quote, "What we don't make conscious will rule our lives and we will call it fate," reminds us that betrayal often happens long before the act itself. It begins in the stories people tell themselves, the justifications they rehearse, the emotional distance they create. By the time the betrayal unfolds, the internal betrayal, the betrayal of one's own values, has already occurred. It's important to realize that not all betrayals are born from cruelty. Some come from fear, some from desperation, and some from people who have never truly known loyalty because it was never modeled for them. People betray others to survive emotionally, to avoid shame, to escape accountability. Loyalty, on the other hand, requires self-awareness, empathy, and emotional regulation, traits that aren't natural but learned, and only through effort. That's why true loyalty is rare. It's not instinctive, it's intentional. It requires a level of maturity that few ever fully reach. And because of that, betrayal becomes a common outcome in a world full of unconscious people walking around with unhealed wounds and hidden fears. But if betrayal is so common, why do we keep falling for it? Why do we keep trusting, loving, and hoping, despite the patterns? The answer lies not only in biology, but in psychology, in how the mind interprets and justifies betrayal. Next, let's explore the hidden psychological motivations behind betrayal, how our minds justify it, and how fear manipulates us into crossing lines we swore we never would. Psychological motivations behind betrayal. Have you ever noticed how someone can hurt you deeply and yet still believe they're a good person? This is one of the most perplexing aspects of betrayal. It's not always committed by the villains we imagine in movies. Often, it's committed by those who genuinely see themselves as kind, fair, or even loyal. This paradox is best understood through the lens of cognitive psychology and emotional intelligence. Our minds are wired in such a way that we justify actions that serve our emotional needs, even when they conflict with our moral values. At the heart of this lies a set of mental shortcuts known as cognitive biases. These are the same shortcuts that help us navigate daily life efficiently, but can also blind us to truth. One of the most common biases at play during betrayal is the self-serving bias. This is our tendency to view our actions in the most favorable light. So when someone betrays you, they might genuinely believe they had no other choice, even if they did. They interpret their behavior as necessary, even noble, while diminishing the damage it causes to others. Another powerful factor is fear, particularly unconscious fear. Carl Jung emphasized that fear doesn't just live in the conscious mind. It burrows deep into the unconscious and becomes part of our psychological operating system. Betrayal often stems not from hatred, but from unprocessed fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of inadequacy, fear of failure. These fears can override logic, compassion, and even identity. According to Jungian psychology, when fear drives the psyche, the shadow takes control. The person doesn't consciously choose betrayal. It happens as a reaction, a reflex, an emotional hijacking. Behavioral economics has also provided strong evidence for how people often act against the interests of others when rewards are involved. In experiments like the ultimatum game, participants consistently make self-interested choices while rationalizing them as fair. This supports the idea that the average person is not only capable of betrayal, they are skilled at justifying it. The betrayal becomes coated in moral sugar, often backed by statements like, "I was protecting myself," or "they would have done the same." This is also where emotional intelligence plays a subtle but crucial role. Emotional intelligence, as explained by Daniel Goleman, includes the ability to regulate one's emotions, recognize others' emotions, and use that information to guide thinking and behavior. A person with low emotional intelligence may react impulsively to a perceived threat, betraying someone simply to escape an uncomfortable situation. On the flip side, someone with high emotional intelligence may use their awareness manipulatively, to deceive, to withhold, or to damage reputations while appearing innocent. This dual nature of emotional intelligence makes betrayal not just a mistake, but sometimes a calculated survival strategy. Fear-based decisions are rarely made out in the open. They're made in moments of silence, behind closed doors, within the privacy of the mind. The betrayer often rewrites the narrative to paint themselves as the victim or hero. This phenomenon, known as moral disengagement, allows people to betray without feeling guilt. They separate the act from their identity, preserving their self-image while leaving others in emotional ruins. Psychological research by Albert Bandura on moral disengagement shows that people use a range of internal strategies to distance themselves from their unethical actions. They minimize the impact, blame the victim, or justify their choices with exaggerated consequences. These mental acrobatics protect their self-esteem while inflicting psychological harm on someone else. So when someone betrays you, remember, it's rarely just about you. It's often a storm of biases, fear, and unconscious defense mechanisms. Understanding this doesn't excuse the betrayal, but it helps you see the psychological machinery behind it. And when you can see that, you're no longer a helpless victim of someone else's choices. You're an informed observer, and that's the beginning of reclaiming your power. Next, we're going to explore what betrayal does to the person who's been betrayed, how it can fracture their sense of identity, and how confronting betrayal can reveal uncomfortable truths about the self. Betrayal and the loss of identity. When someone betrays you, it doesn't just break your heart, it breaks your sense of self. Suddenly, everything you thought you knew about trust, loyalty, and love is thrown into question. But more than that, betrayal attacks your identity. It's not just the other person's action that hurts, it's what it says about who you are. You begin to ask yourself, was I blind? Was I not enough? Did I deserve this? These questions mark the beginning of an internal unraveling. And in many cases, the pain of betrayal lingers not because of what happened, but because of what it revealed about how we see ourselves. Carl Jung spoke at length about the shadow, the hidden unconscious part of our psyche that houses our fears, desires, resentments, and forgotten wounds. And here's where betrayal plays a brutal yet powerful role. It forces us to confront that shadow. When someone betrays you, they often expose the parts of yourself you've ignored. The people pleaser, the idealist, the part of you that projected goodness onto someone who hadn't earned it. Betrayal holds up a mirror, and the reflection isn't always flattering. Psychologically, this is tied to what's called identity disruption. Research in clinical psychology shows that when trust is violated, especially in close relationships, the brain undergoes a kind of emotional disorientation. The betrayal becomes a psychological trauma that doesn't just affect your relationship with the other person, it rewires your understanding of self. You might feel ashamed for not seeing it coming. You might question your judgment, your intuition, even your worth. This erosion of self-trust can lead to anxiety, rumination, and in more severe cases, identity diffusion, a state in which a person loses clarity about who they are. There's also the phenomenon of idealization. Most of us walk around with idealized versions of the people we love. We believe in their goodness, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. This is especially true for those who value harmony, or who were raised in environments where love had to be earned. So when someone betrays us, we're not just losing a person, we're losing a fantasy. And that collapse is traumatic. The psychological betrayal is not just the act itself, but the realization that the version of them you held in your mind never existed. And yet, as painful as this loss of identity is, it can also be the starting point of transformation. Jung believed that suffering was the catalyst for individuation, the process of becoming your true self. He wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Betrayal drags unconscious patterns into the light. It forces you to confront your own vulnerability, your unexamined trust, your unmet emotional needs. It challenges you to reclaim your identity, not as someone dependent on the validation of others, but as someone rooted in their own self-awareness. A powerful reference here is the book, The Drama of the Gifted Child, by Alice Miller. It explains how many people, especially those who seem emotionally mature, develop identities based on meeting others' needs while ignoring their own. These individuals are especially vulnerable to betrayal because they've never been taught to prioritize self-protection. They often mistake enmeshment for connection and end up devastated when the loyalty they've extended isn't returned. So when betrayal hits, it doesn't just reveal the other person's truth. It demands that you confront your own. It tears down the masks you didn't even know you were wearing. And though that process is painful, it's also necessary. Because until you've faced what betrayal teaches you about yourself, you'll keep repeating the same patterns, placing your identity in the hands of people who have no business holding it. In the next section, we'll examine a more subtle form of betrayal, the kind that doesn't explode, but erodes. The kind that hides in silence, absence, and emotional neglect. The silent betrayal. The silent betrayal. Absence as betrayal. Not all betrayals come with knives in the back or sudden storms. Some are quiet, lingering, invisible to the world, but deeply corrosive to the soul. This is the kind of betrayal that doesn't scream, it whispers. It's not what someone did to you, it's what they didn't do. The phone calls they never returned, the words they never said, the times they saw you hurting and looked away. These are betrayals that hide in silence, in absence, in emotional neglect. And yet they hurt just as much, if not more. Psychologists call this attachment injury, and it's especially damaging because it strikes at the core of your need to feel seen, valued, and protected. In relationships, we expect a basic level of emotional presence from those closest to us. When that's withdrawn, without explanation, without closure, it destabilizes your emotional foundation. You begin to question whether your pain matters at all, whether you matter at all. Carl Jung believed that all human beings fear abandonment at a deep unconscious level. This fear doesn't just come from personal experience. It's archetypal. It's wired into us. We fear not only physical abandonment, but emotional desertion, the absence of empathy, the lack of attunement, the feeling of being alone while in the presence of someone who's supposed to care. And that kind of loneliness, being unseen in the eyes of someone you trust, is one of the most brutal forms of betrayal. This is where the work of Ernest Becker in The Denial of Death becomes important. He proposed that much of human behavior is driven by a subconscious terror of mortality, of being insignificant, of being forgotten. And so when someone withholds affection, concern, or emotional support, it taps into our primal dread that we are invisible and unworthy of love. Silent betrayal is therefore not just a relational wound, it's an existential one. This type of betrayal is often minimized. Society doesn't talk about the heartbreak of emotional absence the way it talks about cheating or lying or backstabbing. But psychologists like Dr. Jonas Webb, author of Running on Empty, have shown that emotional neglect can create just as much psychological trauma as overt abuse. The person experiencing it may not have bruises, but they carry invisible scars. Scars of being emotionally starved, dismissed, or ignored. And often, the people who commit these silent betrayals have no idea they're doing it. Or worse, they do know, but justify it by telling themselves they're too tired, too overwhelmed, or that their silence is better than conflict. What they don't realize is that silence is conflict. It's the conflict that leaves no room for resolution. It's the kind of betrayal that offers no closure because it never names itself. The impact of these silent betrayals is cumulative. One missed moment might not feel like much, but add up the times someone failed to stand up for you, failed to notice your suffering, failed to say what needed to be said, and suddenly, you're left holding the weight of a relationship that only existed in your effort. That emotional loneliness can lead to low self-worth, depression, and a desperate hunger for validation, which often gets misdirected into unhealthy relationships or toxic patterns. And yet, this form of betrayal is often the most transformative. Because once you recognize it for what it is, you begin to understand the power of your own attention. You start to see where you've been pouring love into emotional black holes. And in that realization, you reclaim the energy that was quietly being drained from you. In the next section, we'll shift our focus inward again to how betrayal distorts our perception, often without us realizing it. We'll explore how cognitive biases shape our understanding of loyalty, trust, and betrayal, and why we often fail to see the signs, even when they're right in front of us. The cognitive bias in betrayal. It's easy to look back and say, the signs were all there. But in the moment, we often don't see them. Or worse, we see them and choose to ignore them. This isn't because we're naive or foolish. It's because the human brain is a master at editing reality. It filters what we perceive through a set of deeply ingrained mental shortcuts called cognitive biases. And when it comes to betrayal, these biases can cloud our judgment so thoroughly that by the time the truth hits, we feel blindsided. Let's start with confirmation bias. This is our tendency to seek out, interpret, and remember information that confirms what we already believe. If you believe someone is loyal, your mind will highlight every small act of kindness and filter out anything that contradicts that belief. Even red flags get rationalized. If they forget to call you, you tell yourself they're just busy. If they say something cruel, you tell yourself they didn't mean it. Confirmation bias turns betrayal into a slow-motion collapse, one you don't fully recognize until the damage is done. Another powerful force at play is projection bias. This is when we assume others think, feel, and value what we do. If you're loyal, you assume others will be too. If you're incapable of harming someone you love, you project that moral boundary onto others. Carl Jung warned against this. He wrote that the more unconscious we are of our shadow, the more likely we are to project it outward. We either see others as better than they are, or worse, depending on what we've disowned in ourselves. These biases are not just personal quirks. They're neurological shortcuts that evolved to help us survive. According to neuroscientist Tali Sharot, author of The Optimism Bias, the brain is wired to favor positive expectations about people we care about. This bias can lead to overestimating someone's loyalty and underestimating the risk they pose to our emotional well-being. And that's exactly why betrayal feels so devastating. It's not just a violation of trust. It's a collapse of our internal narrative. Add to this the sunk cost fallacy, a term from behavioral economics, and things get even murkier. This fallacy makes us stick with relationships we know are harmful, simply because we've already invested so much. Time, energy, emotion. All of it creates a psychological attachment that's hard to break. So we justify, minimize, and tolerate. We mistake endurance for loyalty. And when betrayal finally happens, it's not just about the act itself. It's about the emotional bankruptcy that was accumulating long before it. The final, and perhaps most subtle cognitive trap, is normalcy bias. This is our tendency to assume that things will continue to be as they've always been. If someone has always been kind, we expect them to stay that way. even when their behavior begins to shift. We tell ourselves, they wouldn't do that, not them. And in that space of denial, betrayal festers. Understanding these biases doesn't make the pain go away, but it gives you back your clarity. It allows you to see that missing the signs wasn't a moral failure. It was a psychological default. And once you're aware of these defaults, you can override them. You can stop waiting for someone to change and start seeing them for who they actually are. But here's the twist. Betrayal doesn't just reveal the flaws in others. It exposes the blind spots in ourselves. In the next section, we'll explore how betrayal can act like a mirror, showing us the parts of ourselves we've avoided, and why this painful revelation is actually the beginning of real psychological transformation. Betrayal is a mirror, revealing our own shadow. When someone betrays you, your first instinct might be to focus entirely on what they did wrong. And that makes sense, because betrayal feels like a rupture, a violent act against trust. But what if, underneath the pain, betrayal was doing something else too? What if it was showing you a reflection, not just of the person who hurt you, but of yourself? Carl Jung believed that the most powerful moments of self-realization come when we're forced to confront the parts of ourselves we've long ignored. He called this shadow work, a process where we acknowledge and integrate the disowned pieces of our personality. And betrayal, as brutal as it is, often pushes us into this work faster than anything else. You see, betrayal doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the space between two people, one who crosses a line, and one who, consciously or not, allowed that line to stay invisible. That doesn't mean the victim is to blame, but it does mean that betrayal forces us to examine how we participated, even passively, in a relationship dynamic that left us vulnerable. For example, were you overgiving, ignoring your intuition, idealizing someone who hadn't earned that pedestal? These aren't signs of weakness. They're signs of unexamined parts of the self trying to win love or avoid conflict. When betrayal strikes, it exposes these patterns. It makes you look at the gap between who you thought you were in the relationship and who you actually were. This internal dissonance can be emotionally shattering, but it can also be transformative. Because in that rupture, you're given a rare opportunity to reclaim the pieces of yourself you outsourced to someone else. Your self-worth, your clarity, your emotional boundaries. Betrayal reminds you, often painfully, that giving these away is dangerous, and that taking them back is essential for growth. There's a beautiful but haunting quote from Jung. The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. Now think about that in the context of betrayal. If you were raised in a family where emotional needs went unmet, where boundaries were blurry, where love had to be earned, you may have internalized a model of relationship where betrayal feels familiar, even inevitable. Your shadow absorbs those early patterns, and unless they're brought to consciousness, you may find yourself reenacting them again and again. This is why betrayal can feel so deeply personal. Because it doesn't just hurt your present, it reactivates your past. It awakens the part of you that always feared being discarded, misunderstood, or unseen. And yet, by confronting this pain, instead of avoiding it, you begin to rewrite your story. You stop chasing people who echo your wounds, and start building relationships that honor your healing. One of the most powerful reads on this topic is Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path by Connie Zweig. It explores how even in our search for love, for spiritual connection, for wholeness, we often carry unconscious wounds that sabotage our deepest desires. Betrayal cracks open that door. It forces you to look inward, and in doing so, it gives you the raw material for genuine transformation. This doesn't mean betrayal is something to welcome, but it does mean that when it happens, you don't have to collapse. You can pause, reflect, and choose to meet the parts of yourself that were hidden all along. That's where the real healing begins. Next, we move into how to transform this awareness into strength. We'll explore how to shift from feeling like a victim of betrayal to becoming someone who holds the power to respond with wisdom, not reaction. From victimhood to empowerment. Betrayal can make you feel powerless, like the rug has been pulled out from under your feet and nothing you believed was ever true. It's easy to stay stuck in that place, replaying the betrayal, asking yourself what you missed, or spiraling into self-blame. But eventually, there's a question that arises like a quiet whisper in the back of your mind. What now? That's the moment everything starts to change. Because while betrayal may strip you of your illusions, it also hands you an invitation. Not to forget, not to pretend, but to transform. The first step in moving from victimhood to empowerment is shifting your perspective. That doesn't mean denying your pain or pretending to be okay. It means recognizing that pain is feedback. It's your mind and body trying to tell you where your boundaries were crossed, where your expectations were violated, and where your values were ignored. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" try asking, "What is this trying to show me about myself and my patterns?" Carl Jung believed that transformation begins when we stop identifying with our suffering and start integrating it into our understanding of self. This doesn't erase the betrayal, but it gives it context. It makes it part of your psychological evolution instead of a source of endless emotional paralysis. This is where emotional intelligence becomes a key tool. Defined by Daniel Goleman, emotional intelligence is the ability to recognize, understand, and manage both your emotions and those of others. When you're betrayed, your first reaction might be to suppress your emotions or let them control you. But emotional intelligence teaches you how to sit with those feelings, understand their roots, and use them as guidance rather than punishment. It's about moving from reactivity to reflection. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, offers another powerful framework. Developed by Aaron Beck, CBT is based on the idea that our thoughts influence our emotions and behaviors. After betrayal, it's common to develop distorted thoughts, like "I can't trust anyone," or "I'm not worth loyalty." CBT techniques help you identify those thoughts, challenge them with evidence, and replace them with more balanced beliefs. Instead of saying, "Everyone will hurt me," you begin to say, "Some people betrayed me, but not everyone will. And I can choose who I give my trust to." A helpful resource in this space is Reinventing Your Life by Janet S. Klosko and Jeffrey Young. It explores the idea of life traps, deep emotional patterns formed in childhood that we unconsciously recreate in adulthood. One of the most common traps is the abandonment trap, where we become hyper-attuned to rejection and betrayal, often pulling people close too quickly or ignoring red flags to avoid being alone. When betrayal happens, the trap gets activated, but with awareness, it can also be dismantled. Empowerment comes when you stop seeing betrayal as the end of your story and start seeing it as a turning point. It's not about becoming unbreakable. It's about becoming someone who is whole, even with the cracks. Someone who doesn't need others to validate their worth. Someone who sets boundaries not out of fear, but from clarity. Betrayal forces a reset. It challenges your values, your expectations, and your sense of what you deserve. And if you let it, it can reintroduce you to a stronger, wiser, more emotionally self-sufficient version of yourself. One who doesn't fear being alone, because they've learned how to be at peace in their own presence. Next, we explore how to prevent falling into the same pattern again, how to recognize the early signs of betrayal, set better boundaries, and stop the trauma cycle from repeating. Breaking the cycle of betrayal. One of the most painful realizations people have after experiencing betrayal isn't just about what happened, it's that it's happened before. Different faces, different scenarios, same wound. And that raises a sobering question. Am I caught in a pattern? The answer, for many, is yes. Betrayal often operates like a loop, quietly repeating itself until we develop the insight and courage to break it. But how do you do that without becoming cynical, guarded, or emotionally numb? The first key is understanding that cycles of betrayal are not random. They're structured by unconscious patterns formed in early emotional experiences. According to developmental psychologist Mary Ainsworth's attachment theory, individuals with anxious or avoidant attachment styles are more likely to end up in relationships that echo betrayal. If you learned early on that love was conditional, or that being seen required pleasing others, you may be subconsciously drawn to relationships that test your worth again and again, not because you want to be hurt, but because the familiarity of that pattern feels like home. Carl Jung would say that what we do not face within ourselves, we attract from others. That's not a spiritual cliché, it's psychological law. Until we become conscious of our hidden wounds and unmet needs, we will unconsciously gravitate toward situations that mirror them. Breaking the cycle of betrayal starts by naming those wounds, not to dwell on them, but to stop them from quietly directing your life. One of the most practical tools for interrupting betrayal patterns is setting and enforcing boundaries. This sounds simple, but for many people, it's revolutionary. A boundary is not a wall to keep others out. It's a filter that protects your emotional energy and clarifies your values. Boundaries tell the world what you will and will not accept. And more importantly, they tell you what kind of relationships you deserve to create. Clinical psychologist Dr. Henry Cloud explains in Boundaries when to say yes, how to say no, that a lack of clear limits often invites exploitation, because people don't know how to treat you unless you show them. Another important part of breaking the cycle is learning to trust your intuition. Often, our bodies sense betrayal before our minds catch up. There's a discomfort, a withdrawal, a silence that feels sharp. But because we don't want to seem paranoid or unkind, we override those instincts. Over time, this erodes self-trust. Rebuilding it means listening more closely to those internal nudges and honoring them, even if they don't come with immediate proof. Psychologist Judith Herman, in her work on trauma recovery, emphasizes the role of safety, remembrance, and reconnection in healing from betrayal. Safety means creating an environment where your emotional needs are met without fear. Remembrance means facing the truth of your story, without minimization or shame. And reconnection means forming new, healthier relationships that are grounded in mutual respect, not dependency or illusion. Breaking the cycle also requires a kind of emotional honesty with yourself. It means asking hard questions. Am I choosing people who mirror my wounds? Am I ignoring red flags because I'm afraid of being alone? Am I trying to fix others so I don't have to fix myself? These questions aren't meant to criticize. They're meant to liberate. You're not doomed to repeat the past, but you are responsible for recognizing its grip on your present. The more you understand your patterns, the more power you have to change them. And that's not just healing, that's transformation. Next, we'll explore one of the most liberating aspects of this journey, the ability to walk away. We'll talk about the healing power of disconnection and why letting go is sometimes the most sacred act of self-respect you can offer yourself. The healing power of disconnection. There's a moment, often after the shock, the tears, the rage, where silence creeps in. You've told your story. You've analyzed the betrayal. You've questioned everything. And now, you're left with a choice that feels deceptively simple. Stay connected to the pain, or choose to let go. That's where the real healing begins. Not in retaliation, not in justification, but in disconnection. And not the kind that's cold or avoidant, the kind that's sacred, intentional, and necessary. Carl Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming your true self, requires separating from what no longer serves your growth. It's not just about walking away from people who've betrayed you. It's about detaching from the version of yourself who tolerated it. The one who gave too many chances. The one who stayed silent when they should have spoken. The one who mistook loyalty for self-abandonment. Disconnection is not abandonment. It's reclamation. It's you taking your energy back from conversations that go nowhere, from apologies that never come, from the hope that one day they'll finally understand. Healing begins when you stop waiting for closure from the one who broke you and start creating closure from within. Because the truth is, most people who betray you will never fully admit it. They may rewrite the story, minimize the harm, or vanish altogether. That's not your work to fix. Your work is to grieve, release, and rebuild. This is where solitude becomes a powerful medicine. Not isolation, but solitude. Time spent with yourself, without distraction, without performance. In solitude, you start hearing your own voice again. You remember who you were before you molded yourself to keep the peace, to hold the relationship, to maintain the illusion. You begin to feel your own presence returning. Quietly, confidently. A powerful framework for understanding this process is found in Clarissa Pinkola Estes' Women Who Run with the Wolves. Though the title speaks to women, the message is universal. She writes about the wild self, the part of us that is instinctual, intuitive, and wise. Betrayal often disconnects us from that self, but solitude reconnects us. It helps us feel what we weren't allowed to feel, say what we were too afraid to say, and finally release what we were never meant to carry. Psychologically, this disconnection also has neurological benefits. When we distance ourselves from toxic emotional patterns, we begin to regulate our nervous system again. The body exits survival mode. Cortisol levels decrease. Sleep improves. The mind begins to process instead of obsess. Neuroscientist Dr. Andrew Huberman has noted that emotional recovery is deeply connected to creating environments where the nervous system feels safe, and disconnection from harmful dynamics is essential for that safety to exist. There's also a spiritual element to disconnection. Many ancient traditions, from Stoicism to Sufism, speak about the power of detachment, not as indifference, but as clarity. To love without clinging, to release without hatred, to see the end of something not as failure, but as evolution. Disconnection becomes a bridge, not to forget the past, but to stop bleeding into it. Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you start caring about yourself more. It means you recognize that your energy is sacred, your peace is non-negotiable, and your life doesn't need to be a battleground for people who haven't made peace with themselves. Now that we've traveled through the darkness of betrayal, it's time to step into something brighter. In the final section, we'll gather all that's been uncovered and show how betrayal, when faced fully, becomes not just a wound, but a portal to your most authentic self. Becoming the unshakable you. You've faced the storm. The illusions have fallen away. The masks have shattered. And what you're left with isn't just the scar of betrayal. It's the skeleton of your real self, waiting to be rebuilt, not as someone who's just okay, but as someone who's unshakable. Because here's the quiet truth no one tells you. Betrayal doesn't break you. It reveals what was already unstable. And in that revelation lies your greatest opportunity for transformation. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Most people never get there. They live inside identities formed by family expectations, social roles, and survival mechanisms. But betrayal rips those layers off. It shows you who you pretended to be in order to be loved, and who you actually are when there's nothing left to protect. That moment of raw clarity is not weakness, it's power. You no longer need to outsource your worth to someone else's approval. You no longer chase people who give love like it's a reward. You no longer beg for closure from someone who didn't have the courage to give you honesty. You begin to realize that the most powerful response to betrayal is not revenge or bitterness. It's becoming someone who doesn't need the validation of the people who failed to see your value in the first place. Psychologist and author Dr. Edith Eger, a Holocaust survivor, says in The Choice that you can't heal what you don't feel. And that's why this process matters. Not to stay stuck in the past, but to honor it. To name the pain. To feel it fully. And then to release it. Consciously. Deliberately. Without apology. This is where psychological resilience is born. Not in pretending you're fine, but in facing every jagged edge of betrayal and deciding that it will not define you. Studies in trauma psychology show that people who develop what's known as post-traumatic growth often emerge from betrayal with greater clarity, deeper empathy, and stronger boundaries. They're not invincible, but they're unshakable, because they've looked into the face of pain and chosen to heal anyway. So what now? Now you choose. You choose to be the person who sees clearly, who knows what betrayal looks like, but also knows what loyalty feels like. You choose to stop begging for crumbs from people who feast on your silence. You choose to trust yourself again, not because you're perfect, but because you've learned from every crack in your heart. You are not just the one who was betrayed. You are the one who survived it. And survival is just the beginning. Because after survival comes becoming. Becoming the version of yourself that betrayal tried to destroy but couldn't. The version who honors their intuition, protects their peace, and no longer fears loss. Because they've already been through it and came out wiser. So ask yourself now, not from a place of pain, but from a place of rising. Who am I becoming because of this? What strength has this pain uncovered in me? And how can I honor the person I'm becoming by never settling for anything less than truth? Betrayal may have shaken you, but now you get to become someone it can't break again. That's the real story. That's the transformation. And that, right there, is the moment you stop surviving betrayal and start mastering yourself. Now take a deep breath. Reflect on what this experience has shown you. And if you're ready, share in the comments below. How has betrayal shaped your growth, and what strength did it awaken in you that you didn't know you had? Your next chapter doesn't begin with someone else's apology. It begins with your decision to rise.